A little boy says, "Hey, sir, my mom has a picture of you in her purse." The man, a billionaire SEAL, stops dead in his tracks when he sees the boy's mom. The city park buzzed with life as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling green. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, dogs barked enthusiastically, and couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths. The world moved with a sense of unhurried joy, a stark contrast to William Caldwell's usual reality. William adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, an odd choice for a leisurely walk. But then again, leisure was a foreign concept to him. As the CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the world, his life revolved around back-to-back meetings, high-stakes decisions, and the constant hum of his phone. Today, however, he had left it behind, a rare indulgence in solitude. Yet as he meandered through the park, the unfamiliar quiet only amplified the ache of loneliness he refused to name. He paused by a large oak tree, watching a group of children chasing bubbles blown by a street performer. A little boy with sandy hair caught his attention, not because he was any different from the others, but because of the infectious enthusiasm with which he chased after the shimmering spheres. The boy's laugh carried through the air, a pure, unrestrained sound that made William's lips twitch into an unexpected smile. Nearby, a woman sat on a bench, her attention divided between a well-worn book and keeping an eye on the boy. Her dark hair framed a kind face, and there was a quiet elegance in the way she sat, one leg crossed over the other. She seemed at ease in a way that was utterly foreign to William, and he found himself lingering, watching the scene unfold like a tableau from a simpler life he'd never known. The boy, having finally caught a bubble, turned to show his prize to the world, but spotted William instead. For a moment they regarded each other, the boy tilting his head as if trying to place a familiar face. Then, without hesitation, the child trotted over, his sneakers crunching softly on the gravel path. "Hey, mister," the boy said, craning his neck to look up at William. His wide blue eyes sparkled with curiosity. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." William blinked, caught entirely off guard. "She does?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "Are you sure it's me?" The boy nodded emphatically. "Yeah, I saw it. It's kind of old, though. You look younger in it, but it's definitely you." William's mind raced. He'd encountered his fair share of strange situations, but this was new territory. Who was this boy's mother, and why would she have an old photo of him? It wasn't the kind of thing one could brush off lightly. "What's your name?" William asked, his voice softening. "Victor," the boy said proudly. "That's my dog over there. His name's Max. Want to see him do a trick?" William chuckled, genuinely charmed by the boy's straightforwardness. "Maybe in a minute, Victor. Can you tell me where's your mom?" Victor pointed toward the bench where the woman still sat, her attention now on them. Her expression had shifted from relaxed to guarded, her body slightly tense as though preparing to intervene. "That's her," Victor said. "Her name's Mom, but other people call her Eliza." William's chest tightened. Eliza. He hadn't heard that name in over a decade, yet it rang in his ears like a bell. Could it really be that Eliza, the one he had known long ago, before his life became a whirlwind of success and sacrifice? The thought seemed impossible, and yet, as he looked closer, the familiarity of her features struck him like a lightning bolt. "I think I need to meet your mom," William said, his tone more serious now. Victor shrugged as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Okay, come on." He grabbed William's hand without hesitation and tugged him toward the bench. William followed, his heart pounding in a way that no boardroom confrontation or business deal ever had. Each step brought him closer to a past he thought was buried, a past he might not be ready to confront. Eliza rose to her feet as they approached, her book forgotten on the bench. Up close, there was no denying it. It was her. Time had softened her features, but hadn't diminished the quiet strength in her eyes. She looked at him with a mixture of shock and apprehension, her hands gripping the strap of her purse as if it were a lifeline. "William," she said softly, her voice laced with disbelief. "Eliza," he replied, his throat dry. It's been a long time. Neither of them moved for a moment, the weight of unspoken history hanging between them. Finally, Eliza forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I, William admitted, his gaze flicking to Victor. But it seems your son has an interesting way of starting conversations. Eliza's face flushed, and she glanced down at Victor, who was now preoccupied with showing Max's latest trick to a small crowd of children. I'm sorry if he bothered you. He's curious. No bother, William said quickly. But he mentioned something about a picture? Eliza's grip on her purse tightened. It's nothing, she said too quickly. Just an old photo. An old photo of me? William pressed, his curiosity tinged with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Why would you still have that? Eliza hesitated, her eyes darting away. It's complicated. William wanted to push, to demand answers, but the vulnerability in her expression held him back. Instead, he took a step back, giving her space. I didn't mean to pry. It's just surprising. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I understand. It's just... Mom! Victor's voice interrupted as he ran back over, holding Max's leash. Max did his trick. Did you see? Eliza smiled down at him, her tension melting away for a brief moment. I saw, sweetheart. Good job. William watched the exchange, a pang of something unfamiliar tugging at him. There was a warmth between them, a bond that was both beautiful and painful to witness. I should go, Eliza said suddenly, her voice cutting through his thoughts. It was good to see you, William, really. Wait, William said, stepping forward. Can we talk? Just for a few minutes? Eliza hesitated, looking down at Victor, who was already distracted by a nearby ice cream cart. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but not here. William nodded, a strange mix of relief and apprehension washing over him as Eliza led Victor away. He couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was about to unravel a thread he hadn't even realized was loose, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was ready to see where it led. The coffee shop Eliza chose was tucked into the corner of a quiet street far from the park's lively atmosphere. Its warm interior buzzed faintly with the hum of espresso machines and murmured conversations. Eliza had picked a table near the back where they could speak without interruption. William followed her lead, his thoughts racing though his expression remained carefully composed. Victor sat between them, happily digging into a chocolate chip cookie that Eliza had bought to occupy him. Max lay at his feet, content and still. William noticed how Eliza's hand hovered protectively over her purse, her grip firm on its leather strap, as if shielding its contents from the world. Or maybe just from him. Neither of them spoke at first. Eliza kept her eyes on Victor, brushing stray crumbs from his shirt. William, however, couldn't stop staring at her. She looked so much like the woman he had known years ago, yet different. Time had etched faint lines on her face and softened her once sharp features, but the clarity of her gaze, the quiet confidence in her posture, was unmistakable. You haven't changed much, William said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Eliza let out a soft laugh, though it lacked humor. I'm not sure if that's true, but I appreciate the sentiment. It's been what, 15 years? He asked, leaning back in his chair. His tone was casual, but the question carried a weight he couldn't conceal. Closer to 20, Eliza corrected, meeting his gaze briefly before looking away. It's been a long time. William nodded, absorbing the truth of her words. 20 years. It didn't feel possible. The last time he had seen her, they had been standing on the cusp of their adult lives, full of dreams and plans that at the time had seemed unshakable. But life had a way of unraveling even the best-laid plans. I never thought I'd see you again, he admitted, let alone in a park through your son. Eliza stiffened slightly, her hand tightening on her purse. Life is funny that way. William's gaze dropped to the bag where he knew the photo must still be hidden. He hesitated, not wanting to overstep, but his curiosity burned too brightly to ignore. Victor mentioned a photo, he said carefully. "Of me from when we were younger." Eliza froze, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't answer immediately, instead focusing on wiping Victor's hands with a napkin. William waited, sensing the tension building between them. "It's nothing," she said finally, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "Just an old picture." "I'd like to see it," he said gently, "if you don't mind." Eliza's eyes snapped to his, and for a moment, he saw something raw in her expression, something close to fear. "Why?" she asked, her tone guarded. "Why does it matter?" William paused, caught off guard by her reaction. "Because I'm curious. Because it's strange to think that after all these years you'd still have something like that." Her gaze wavered, flickering between him and Victor, who was now preoccupied with the drawing he'd started on the back of a napkin. Finally, she let out a resigned sigh and reached into her purse. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were giving herself time to reconsider, but she didn't stop. A moment later, she pulled out a small, slightly creased photograph and placed it on the table between them. William picked it up, his breath catching as he studied the image. It was a snapshot from another lifetime, taken on a summer afternoon he hadn't thought about in years. He and Eliza stood side by side, smiling at the camera, their arms slung casually around each other's shoulders. He looked impossibly young, his face free of the lines and tension that now defined him. Eliza, too, looked different, lighter, more carefree. "I remember this day," he said quietly, his thumb brushing over the edge of the photo. "It was just before I left for college. We went to the lake." Eliza nodded, though her expression was unreadable. "You insisted on bringing that old camera of yours. You said we'd want pictures to look back on." William's chest tightened. "I didn't think you'd still have this." "I didn't, for a long time," Eliza admitted, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "I found it years later, tucked into an old book. I didn't mean to keep it, but I guess I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." Her honesty caught him off guard. "Why not?" he asked, his tone softer now. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the table. "Because it reminded me of a time when things were simpler, happier, before everything got so complicated." William studied her, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to ask what had gone wrong, why they had drifted so far apart, but deep down, he already knew. His ambition, his drive to succeed had always come first. He had been so focused on building his future that he hadn't realized what he was leaving behind. "Eliza," he began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "Don't," she said quietly. "It's in the past, William. There's no point in digging it up now." "But there's obviously something here," he pressed, gesturing to the photo. "Why else would you carry this with you?" "It's not what you think," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I kept it because it's a piece of my past, not because I'm still holding on to anything." William leaned back, digesting her words. He wanted to believe her, but something about the way she avoided his gaze told him there was more to the story. Still, he knew better than to push her further, at least not now. Victor suddenly looked up from his drawing, his face bright with excitement. "Look, Mom, I drew Max." Eliza smiled, the tension in her face easing as she turned her attention to him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Max looks just like himself." William watched the exchange in silence, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Eliza's love for her son was obvious, and it stirred something in him that he couldn't quite name. A longing, perhaps, for the kind of connection he had spent years avoiding. As Victor went back to his drawing, William glanced at Eliza again. "Thank you," he said quietly, sliding the photo back across the table, "for showing me this." Eliza nodded, but didn't respond. Instead, she slipped the picture back into her purse and stood. "We should go," she said, her voice steady but distant. "It's getting late." William wanted to stop her, to ask her to stay and talk, but he knew she wouldn't. Whatever walls she had built between them weren't coming down so easily. So he simply stood and offered a small smile. "It was good to see you again," he said, "really." Eliza met his gaze for a brief moment before looking away. "You too." As she gathered Victor and Max, William watched them go, the image of the photo still vivid in his mind. He didn't know what he had expected to find today, but it wasn't this, a glimpse of a life he might have had, a life that still lingered in the shadows of his past, and for the first time in years, he found himself wondering what might have been. The sound of Eliza's voice lingered in William's mind long after she left the cafe. The way she had said his name, a mix of surprise, caution, and something unspoken, had stirred feelings he hadn't thought about in years. As he walked back to his car, the edges of the past began to creep into his thoughts, vivid and unbidden. He had met Eliza during his final year of high school, when life still felt boundless and full of possibility. She had been the kind of person who could light up a room with just her presence, effortlessly drawing people in with her warmth and intelligence. William, by contrast, had been more reserved, the ambitious dreamer always one step ahead in his mind, planning the next move. Their relationship had started innocently enough, born from a shared love of literature and a chance meeting in the school library. What began as casual conversations about books and life had quickly deepened into something more. Eliza had a way of grounding William, pulling him out of his relentless drive and reminding him to enjoy the present. They had spent that last summer together, a blur of long walks, late-night talks, and shared dreams. William had been accepted into a prestigious university on the other side of the country, and Eliza had been nothing but supportive, even as they both knew what his departure would mean. He remembered their final days together with painful clarity. They had made promises they couldn't keep, vowing to stay in touch, to visit whenever they could. But life had a way of unraveling even the best intentions. His first year at university had been a whirlwind of classes, internships, and networking events, leaving little time for anything else. Their calls became less frequent, their letters fewer and farther between, until one day they simply stopped. William hadn't meant to let her slip away. He had told himself that his career needed to come first, that there would be time later to revisit what they had, but later never came. By the time he realized what he had lost, it felt too late to go back. Now, standing in the quiet of the parking lot, he couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he had made different choices. Would they have stayed together? Would they have built a life, a family? Victor's face flashed in his mind. The boy had Eliza's bright energy, her easy smile, but there had been something about him, an echo of familiarity that William couldn't quite place. The thought nagged at him, growing louder with each passing moment. When William finally made it home, the emptiness of his sprawling penthouse felt even more oppressive than usual. He dropped his keys on the counter and poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it in the glass. He sat by the window, the city skyline stretching out before him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Victor. How old was he? 8? 9? William did the math in his head, his chest tightening as the timeline aligned uncomfortably close to the last time he had seen Eliza. But it didn't make sense. She had told him Victor wasn't his son, and there had been no hesitation in her denial. Still, the thought refused to let go. William reached for his phone, half tempted to call her and demand answers, but he stopped himself. What would he even say? That he had been sitting alone, obsessing over a child he had only just met? That he couldn't stop wondering if there was a chance he was the boy's father? It was absurd. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Eliza had let on. The memories kept flooding back, unrelenting. He saw Eliza in her favorite sundress, laughing as she splashed him with water at the lake. He heard her voice teasing him for being too serious, always planning, never just being. He felt the weight of her head on his shoulder during their last night together, the unspoken sadness hanging between them as they tried to pretend everything would stay the same. William leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For years, he had convinced himself that his success was worth the sacrifices he had made, that the long hours, the missed connections, and the solitude were all part of the cost. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. The next day, he found himself back at the park, drawn there by some unexplainable pull. He didn't expect to see Eliza or Victor again, but he needed to feel closer to the moment they had shared. He walked the same path, pausing by the bench where she had been sitting, the book she had been reading still stuck in his mind, though he hadn't been able to make out the title. He was about to leave when a familiar voice stopped him. "William?" He turned to see Eliza standing a few feet away, Victor holding her hand. She looked surprised to see him, but not entirely displeased. "Eliza," he said, his heart quickening. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," she replied, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Victor tugged at her hand. "Can we go see Max? He's waiting." "In a minute, sweetheart," Eliza said gently. She looked back at William, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I guess I was hoping to run into you," he admitted. "There's a lot I didn't get to say yesterday." Eliza sighed, her shoulders tensing. "William, I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Eliza, you can't just show up in my life after 20 years with no explanation and expect me not to have questions." "I didn't show up in your life," she said sharply. "Victor ran into you. This wasn't planned." "Maybe not," he conceded, "but now that it's happened, I think we owe it to ourselves to have an honest conversation." Eliza hesitated, glancing down at Victor, who was growing impatient. "Not here," she said finally. "This isn't the time." "When then?" William pressed. "Because I'm not going to just let this go." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and something else, something softer. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I have to think about it." William nodded, though the answer didn't satisfy him. "Okay, but I'm not walking away, Eliza, not this time." Eliza didn't respond. Instead, she took Victor's hand and turned to leave, her steps brisk and determined. William watched them go, his chest heavy with unanswered questions and unresolved feelings. As he stood there alone once again, he realized that this was only the beginning. The threads of their past were unraveling, pulling him towards something he couldn't yet define. And for the first time in years, he felt both terrified and alive. William stared at the ceiling of his office, the familiar hum of his phone vibrating against the desk. The pile of contracts awaiting his signature sat untouched, a rarity for someone known for his razor-sharp focus. His mind was miles away, stuck in a relentless loop of questions that had no answers. Eliza's guarded expression, the photo in her purse, Victor's curious resemblance to someone he couldn't quite place. Every detail replayed endlessly, each thought pulling him further into a web of possibilities. By the time the day ended, William had made a decision. He knew it was intrusive, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Eliza wasn't telling him. He needed answers, not just for himself, but because he couldn't let go of the notion that their encounter wasn't mere coincidence. The following morning, William made a discreet call to a trusted private investigator, Lucy Carter. Lucy had worked for William's company in the past, often untangling corporate espionage or vetting high-profile acquisitions. This, however, was a different kind of case. "I need you to look into someone," William said, leaning back in his chair as he spoke. "Her name is Eliza Evans. She lives here in the city, with her son, Victor Evans." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lucy replied, his tone cautious. "This isn't for business, is it?" "No," William admitted. "It's personal. But I need you to handle it with care. No overstepping boundaries. Just find out what you can about their lives." Lucy agreed, and as the call ended, William leaned forward, rubbing his temples. The decision weighed on him immediately. He had always respected Eliza's independence and hated the idea of invading her privacy, but he told himself it was the only way to understand the bigger picture, if there even was one. The next few days passed slowly, marked by an undercurrent of guilt and anticipation. William threw himself into work, trying to distract himself, but the questions lingered. Every time he saw Victor's bright smile in his mind, or remembered Eliza's hesitant answers, the knot in his chest tightened. Lucy finally called him late on a Thursday evening. "I've got the information you asked for," Lucy said. "Are you free to go over it now?" William nodded, even though Lucy couldn't see him. "I'm listening." "Eliza Evans is a single mother," Lucy began. "She works as a registered nurse at a local hospital. She's lived in the same modest apartment for the last 9 years and doesn't have any significant financial connections. At least nothing linking her to you or your company. No loans, no payments, no legal ties of any kind." William felt a pang of relief, though it was fleeting. He hadn't been sure what he was expecting to hear, but the lack of financial entanglement eased at least one fear. Eliza hadn't sought him out for money. "Victor Evans," Lucy continued, "is 9 years old, born in this city. No father listed on his birth certificate." William's heart skipped a beat at that detail, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Go on." "From what I can tell, Eliza's been raising him on her own since he was born. No records of co-parenting arrangements, no claims for child support. She's independent, and by all accounts, she's doing a good job of it. Her neighbors describe her as kind but private. Works long hours, but always makes time for Victor." William closed his eyes, picturing Eliza in her small apartment, juggling work and motherhood with the same strength and determination he remembered from years ago. The image stirred something deep within him, admiration, but also guilt. He had been chasing his dreams while she had been building a life without him. "Do you want me to dig deeper?" Lucy asked after a moment. "No," William said quickly. "You've done enough." "Thank you, Lucy." After ending the call, William sat in silence, staring out at the city lights from his penthouse window. The information Lucy had uncovered painted a picture of Eliza's life, but it didn't answer the question that nagged at him most. Why had she kept the photo? Why had she hidden Victor's father's identity? And perhaps most troubling of all, was there any chance that Victor was his son? William's thoughts returned to the timeline. 9 years old, born roughly a year after he and Eliza had parted ways. It wasn't impossible, but Eliza's insistence that Victor wasn't his child had been firm. Still, the lack of a father's name on the birth certificate lingered in his mind. The guilt of prying into her life was heavier now. Eliza had clearly worked hard to provide for her son without relying on anyone else, let alone him. She had built a life, however modest, that seemed full of love and stability. What right did he have to disrupt that? But the image of the photo haunted him. Eliza's explanation that it was simply a piece of her past felt incomplete. People didn't carry around reminders of someone they had forgotten. That photo meant something to her, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. William poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, letting the silence of his apartment settle around him. He thought of the life he had built, full of wealth and success, but empty in so many ways. And then he thought of Eliza and Victor, two people who in a matter of days had awakened a part of him he had buried long ago. The next morning, William found himself standing outside the hospital where Eliza worked. He hadn't planned to come, but his feet had carried him there before his mind had caught up. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish. Maybe just a conversation, an apology for invading her privacy, or even a chance to ask the questions that burned in his chest. But as he stood there, watching nurses and doctors pass by the large glass doors, he hesitated. Eliza had every right to her privacy, to the life she had built without him. Showing up unannounced felt wrong, even if his intentions were good. He turned to leave, but a familiar voice stopped him. "William?" He turned to see Eliza standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. She was dressed in her scrubs, her hair tied back, and she looked both tired and beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. "What are you doing here?" she asked, stepping closer. William hesitated, searching for the right words. "I didn't mean to bother you," he said finally. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation." Eliza's expression softened slightly, though her guard didn't drop entirely. "William, I don't know what you're looking for, but I don't think you're going to find it here." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I can't let this go without understanding. Eliza, why did you keep that photo? Why do you still have it after all this time?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's complicated." "Then explain it to me," he said, his voice quieter now. "Because I've spent the last few days wondering if I made a mistake letting you go, and I don't think I can live with myself if I don't try to understand." Eliza met his gaze, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name: pain, longing, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of hope. But she didn't answer. Instead, she sighed and looked toward the hospital doors. "I have to get back to work," she said softly. "I can't do this right now." William nodded, though the ache in his chest deepened. "I'll wait," he said simply. "Whenever you're ready." Eliza hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked away, leaving William standing alone with more questions than answers. The air was crisp that evening, as William stood outside Eliza's apartment building, a modest brick structure nestled in a quiet neighborhood. The faint hum of city life buzzed in the background, distant enough to let the stillness settle in. He had hesitated before coming, unsure if showing up unannounced would push Eliza further away, but the unanswered questions wouldn't let him rest, and he needed clarity, needed her to fill in the gaps. He rang the doorbell and waited, his heart pounding as footsteps approached. The door opened slowly, and there she was, her expression a mixture of surprise and guardedness. "William?" Eliza said, her voice low. She glanced behind her briefly before stepping out into the hallway. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said. "I couldn't leave things the way they were." Eliza sighed, her fingers brushing the doorframe as if debating whether to let him in. Finally, she nodded, stepping aside. "Victor's in his room doing homework. Keep your voice down." William entered, taking in the small but cozy living space. The furniture was simple, well-loved, but neatly maintained. A few framed photos lined the walls, most of them of Victor, his grinning face beaming from school portraits, candid shots, and a few snapshots with Max. The apartment spoke of a life built on love and hard work, and William felt a pang of guilt for intruding. Eliza motioned for him to sit on the worn couch, but she didn't join him, instead crossing her arms as she stood by the window. The tension in the room was palpable. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "This isn't fair to me or Victor." "I know," William replied, his voice steady. "But I can't stop thinking about that photo, about everything we've left unsaid. I need to understand, Eliza." She turned to face him, her eyes flashing with frustration. "Understand what, William? That I kept a picture from a time in my life when I thought we might have had a future? That I held on to it because it reminded me of a version of myself that felt happy, even if it was fleeting?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he held her gaze. "You didn't just keep it," he said. "You carry it with you. That's not something people do for a memory they've moved on from." Eliza's shoulders slumped, and she let out a breath. "You don't know what my life has been like, William. You don't get to judge why I kept it." "I'm not judging you," he said quickly. Eliza, you're carrying a photo of us while raising a son who's 9 years old. The timing, it doesn't add up." Her face hardened. "Victor isn't your son." "Then tell me why I feel like there's something you're not saying," William pressed. "Because I can't stop wondering if I've missed out on something, someone I should have known about." Eliza rubbed her temples, her voice trembling as she replied, "I already told you, William. Victor's father isn't in the picture. He never was. You don't have to read into it any more than that." "Then why the photo?" William asked, his voice softening. "Why carry it with you all these years?" Eliza hesitated, her defenses cracking just slightly. She sank onto the armchair across from him, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. "Because," she began slowly, "it was the last time I felt like my life was on a path I understood. After you left, everything changed. I didn't plan on being a single mother. I didn't plan on raising a child alone, working double shifts to make ends meet. That picture, it reminded me of a time when things felt possible, when I felt like I wasn't carrying the world on my shoulders." Her voice broke and she quickly looked away, wiping at her eyes. William leaned forward, his own guilt weighing heavier than ever. "Eliza," he said gently, "I'm sorry for everything I put you through back then, for leaving without looking back. I thought I was doing the right thing, focusing on my future, but I see now how selfish that was. It doesn't matter anymore, she said, her voice thick. We both moved on. I've built a life for myself, and so have you. But it does matter, he insisted, because even if we've moved on, I still care about you, and I care about Victor. I can't just ignore the possibility. I told you, Eliza interrupted, her tone sharp. Victor isn't your son. The finality of her words hung in the air, and William leaned back, struggling to accept them. Still, doubt lingered at the edges of his mind. He watched her carefully, searching her face for any sign of hesitation, any crack in the armor she wore so tightly. If that's true, he said slowly, then why not tell me about him sooner? Why not let me be part of your life, even as a friend? Eliza hesitated, her gaze flickering to the hallway where Victor's room was. Because it was easier this way, she admitted. Easier to keep the past in the past, to let you go without dragging you into something you didn't ask for. William's chest tightened. But what if I wanted to be part of it? She shook her head, her expression weary. You don't understand, William. When I found out I was pregnant, I had to make decisions on my own. I couldn't count on anyone else to step up. Not you, not anyone. And I've done my best to give Victor the life he deserves. William wanted to argue, to tell her she hadn't given him the chance, but he knew it wasn't fair to question the choices she had made under circumstances he couldn't fully comprehend. I'm not here to take anything away from you, he said finally. I just want to understand, to know the truth. Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and something that resembled guilt, but she didn't speak. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street below. The truth is, she said quietly, I kept the photo because I needed a reminder of what I used to believe in, of who I used to be. It doesn't mean anything more than that. Her words felt like a wall coming down between them, impenetrable and immovable. William stood, his heart heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. I don't know if I believe that, he said softly, but I'll respect it for now. Eliza didn't turn around, and William took that as his cue to leave. He made his way to the door, pausing for a moment before stepping out. Eliza, he said, his voice firm but kind, if you ever want to tell me more, if there's ever anything you need, I'll be here. She nodded, still facing the window, and William left, the door clicking shut behind him. As he walked down the hallway and out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was still just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. A week passed after William's visit to Eliza's apartment, but the encounter stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He tried to throw himself into work, to drown out the lingering doubts and unanswered questions, but nothing helped. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eliza's guarded expression and Victor's bright smile. Something still didn't sit right. Then one evening, William's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally he wouldn't have answered. It could wait or be filtered through his assistant. But something about this call felt different. He picked up, his voice clipped with curiosity. William Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, this is Lily, the voice on the other end said hesitantly. Eliza's sister. William froze. He hadn't heard that name in decades. Back when he and Eliza had been together, Lily had been the protective older sister, always watching out for Eliza, but never quite approving of William's ambitious streak. Lily, he said cautiously, it's been a long time. It has, she agreed, her tone soft but firm. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I thought about it for a while, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. William leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. What's this about? It's about Eliza, Lily said, and Victor. His breath hitched. What about them? There was a long pause, and when Lily spoke again, her voice was strained. I know my sister hasn't been completely honest with you. She has her reasons, but I think you deserve to know the truth. William's heart pounded as he waited for her to continue. Victor is your son. The words hit him like a freight train, leaving him stunned. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't think. It was as though the world had tilted on its axis, and everything he thought he knew about his past had been rewritten in an instant. "That's not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eliza told me. She said he wasn't mine." "She's been lying," Lily said bluntly. "She didn't want to tell you because she thought it would ruin your life. You were so focused on your career back then, on making a name for yourself. She thought if you knew about Victor, you'd feel obligated to stay, and she didn't want to hold you back." William's chest tightened, anger and heartbreak warring within him. "She didn't think I had the right to make that choice for myself?" "She thought she was doing the right thing," Lily said. "You have to understand, William. Eliza was scared. She was young, alone, and trying to figure out how to raise a child. She didn't want to burden you. And by the time she thought about telling you, it felt like too much time had passed." William stood and began pacing, his thoughts racing. "And you knew this whole time?" "Yes," Lily admitted. "But I didn't agree with her decision. I begged her to tell you, but she was adamant. She didn't want me to feel trapped." He pressed his hand against his forehead, trying to process the weight of her words. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know," Lily said simply. "And Victor deserves to know his father. He's a wonderful kid, William. Smart, kind, so full of life. He's everything good about Eliza and you." William's chest ached at the thought. All those moments he had missed, the first steps, the first words, the milestones he hadn't even known to look for. And Victor, growing up without a father, while William had spent years focused solely on himself. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice raw. "You don't have to say anything right now," Lily said. "I just needed you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation pressing down on both of them. Finally, William spoke, his voice resolute. "Thank you, Lily, for telling me." After ending the call, William sank onto his couch, staring blankly at the skyline outside his window. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at Eliza for keeping this from him, guilt for not being there for Victor, and a deep, aching sadness for all the time they had lost. That night, sleep was impossible. He replayed every moment he had spent with Eliza and Victor, now seeing it all through a new lens, the photo in her purse, her hesitations, her deflections, the way Victor had unknowingly bridged the gap between them. It all made sense now, but that didn't make it hurt any less. By morning, William knew he couldn't sit with this information alone. He needed to confront Eliza, to hear her side of the story, and understand why she had made the choices she did. When he arrived at her apartment, his knock was firm, determined. Eliza opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw him. "William," she said, her voice laced with caution. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Eliza hesitated, glancing back into the apartment. "Victor's not here. He's at school." "That's probably for the best," William said, "because this conversation isn't about him. It's about us." She nodded reluctantly and stepped aside to let him in. The tension in the room was palpable as they sat across from each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "I talked to Lily," William said, watching her closely. Eliza stiffened, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "She had no right. She told me the truth," he interrupted, his voice firm, "that Victor is my son." Eliza's face crumpled and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "William, Why?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe he wasn't mine?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she finally looked at him, her expression filled with anguish. "Because I thought I was doing the right thing. You were so focused on your career, on building your future. I didn't want to derail that. I didn't want you to feel obligated to stay with me." "You didn't think I had the right to know?" he asked, his voice rising. "That I might have wanted to be part of his life?" Eliza wiped at her tears, shaking her head. "I was scared, William. I was young and alone, and I didn't know what to do. By the time I thought about telling you, it felt like too much time had passed. I convinced myself that you were better off not knowing." William stood, pacing the room as he tried to process her words. "You don't get to make that decision for me. You robbed me of 8 years with my son, Eliza. 8 years I'll never get back." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "And I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you or Victor. I thought I was protecting both of you." He stopped and looked at her, his anger softening as he saw the pain in her eyes. "You weren't protecting us," he said quietly. "You were protecting yourself." Eliza flinched, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, tears streaming down her face. William took a deep breath, his emotions still raw but more controlled. "I need time to process this," he said, "but I want to be part of Victor's life. He deserves to know the truth." Eliza nodded again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." As William left her apartment, he felt a mixture of relief and devastation. The truth was out, but the road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and challenges he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But one thing was clear: he couldn't turn back now. Victor was his son, and he was determined to make up for the time they had lost. The morning was cold and crisp as William parked his car outside Eliza's apartment building. He'd spent the entire night wrestling with everything he had learned, trying to process the weight of it all. No matter how many times he turned it over in his mind, he couldn't escape the ache of betrayal or the overwhelming sense of loss. But there was something stronger than his anger or sadness, an unshakable need to be part of Victor's life. Eliza opened the door with a look of quiet resignation, as if she had been expecting him. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. William walked into the apartment, the now familiar coziness of the space doing little to calm his nerves. Eliza gestured to the couch, but he remained standing. "I talked to Lily again," William said, cutting straight to the point. "She told me everything." Eliza closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders sagging. "I figured she would," she said softly. "I told her not to, but I knew she wouldn't keep it from you forever." "She did the right thing," William replied, his tone sharp but not unkind. "You should have told me, Eliza. You owed me that." "I know," she said, looking down at her hands. "I know I should have, but I didn't know how. I was scared, William. You were already gone, building your life, your career. I didn't want to be the reason you stopped chasing your dreams." "That wasn't your choice to make," William said, his voice rising. "You made that decision for me, and you kept my son from me for 9 years. 8 years, Eliza." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held his gaze. "You think I don't regret it? I've thought about telling you 1,000 times, but every time I convinced myself it was too late, that you had moved on and didn't need this in your life." William ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small living room. "It wasn't just about me, it was about Victor. Don't you think he deserves to know his father?" "Of course he does," Eliza said, her voice breaking. "But I didn't know how to tell him. He's happy, William. He's a good kid, and he's been through enough already. I didn't want to turn his world upside down." William stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression softening. "Eliza, I'm not here to take him away from you. I just want to be part of his life. I've already missed so much. I don't want to miss anything else." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's not that simple. Victor doesn't know you're his father. To him, you're just a nice man from the park. What happens if we tell him the truth? What if it confuses him or makes him feel like everything he's known is a lie?" "We'll figure it out together," William said. "But I can't keep pretending he's not my son. He deserves the truth, and I want to get to know him. Really know him." Before Eliza could respond, the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hallway. Victor appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily and holding Max's leash. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Eliza quickly wiped at her eyes, forcing a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. William just stopped by to talk." Victor's face lit up when he saw William. "William, are you here to see Max do more tricks?" William chuckled, his heart warming at the boy's enthusiasm. "Maybe later. How about you? How are you doing?" "Good," Victor said, beaming. "We're going to the park later. Are you coming too?" Eliza stiffened, clearly caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth to respond, but William spoke first. "I'd love to," he said, his gaze flicking to Eliza as he added, "if it's okay with your mom." Victor turned to Eliza, his eyes wide and hopeful. "Please, Mom, William can come, right?" Eliza hesitated, her resolve wavering as she looked between her son and William. Finally, she let out a small sigh and nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "He can come." Victor let out a cheer and ran back to his room to get ready, leaving Eliza and William alone again. The tension in the air was palpable, but something unspoken passed between them. A tentative understanding, fragile but real. "Thank you," William said, his voice soft. Eliza nodded, though her expression was still conflicted. "This doesn't mean I'm ready to tell him everything," she said. "Not yet." "I understand," William replied, "but I'm not going anywhere, Eliza. I'm here for you, and for Victor." A short while later, they found themselves back at the park. Victor ran ahead with Max, laughing as the dog chased after a frisbee. Eliza and William walked side by side, the weight of their conversation still lingering between them. "You're good with him," Eliza said after a long silence. "Victor, I mean. He likes you." "I like him too," William said. "He's a great kid, and he deserves the best." Eliza looked down, her fingers brushing against the strap of her purse. "I've tried my best to give him that." "You've done an amazing job," William said sincerely. "I can see how much he loves you." Eliza smiled faintly, her expression softening. "Thank you." As they watched Victor play, a sense of calm settled over them. For the first time in days, William felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for all of them. "Hey, William," Victor called out, waving him over. "Come play with us." William glanced at Eliza, who nodded, her lips curving into a hesitant smile. He jogged over to join Victor, his laughter mingling with the boys as they played with Max. From the bench, Eliza watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope, maybe, just maybe, this could work. The weeks that followed were a blur of change for William. True to his word, he began carving out time from his demanding schedule to spend with Victor. At first, it was simple outings, trips to the park, afternoons tossing a frisbee with Max, or sitting together over ice cream as Victor animatedly told stories about school and his favorite video games. Each moment was a revelation for William, peeling back the layers of the boy who was so full of energy, curiosity, and a boundless enthusiasm for life. The bond between them grew naturally, and before long Victor began to look forward to William's visits with an excitement that melted Eliza's lingering hesitations. She watched them together from a distance at first, unsure of how to let William fully into the life she'd built so carefully. But as time passed, her walls began to crumble bit by bit. William, too, found himself changing. For years his life had revolved around his career, the endless pursuit of success and the hollow victories that came with it. Now, as he balanced meetings with afternoons at the park or school pickups, he realized how much he'd been missing. His priorities began to shift, and with them, so did his outlook on the life he wanted to build moving forward. One evening, after Victor had gone to bed, William and Eliza sat together in the small living room of her apartment. The television played softly in the background, but neither of them paid it much attention. "You're good with him," Eliza said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He's happier since you've been around. I think he's always felt like something was missing, even if he didn't know what." William smiled, though there was a tinge of sadness in his expression. "He's a great kid, Eliza. I just wish I'd known sooner. I hate that I missed so much." Eliza looked down at her hands, her voice soft. "I know I made the wrong choice keeping it from you. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was wrong. I'm sorry." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "What matters is that we're here now for him. That's all I want, to be there for him and to do it with you. However we figure this out." Eliza looked up at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I want that too." From that moment, they began to navigate the complexities of co-parenting. There were awkward moments, heated conversations, and times when the past threatened to overshadow their progress. But there were also shared victories, watching Victor excel in school, celebrating his birthday together, and discovering the joy of simply being a family, even if it wasn't in the way they'd once imagined. William learned to let go of the constant demands of his work, delegating more and trusting his team to handle the details. For the first time, he found a balance that didn't feel like a compromise. His time with Victor became a source of strength and clarity, grounding him in a way he hadn't thought possible. One sunny afternoon, the three of them found themselves back at the park where it had all started. Victor ran ahead with Max, his laughter ringing out as the dog chased a ball. William and Eliza walked behind him side by side, their steps easy and unhurried. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" William asked, glancing at Eliza. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. What matters is where we are now, and I think, for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that." William nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Me too." They reached the bench and sat down, watching as Victor played. The warmth of the sun, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the sight of their son's happiness surrounded them like a quiet reassurance. In that moment, the past didn't feel as heavy, and the future didn't seem as uncertain. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough.